In the grand silent theater of Courtroom 4B, Judge Arthur Sterling was not a man. He was an institution. For 40 years he had sat upon his judicial throne, a figure carved from oak and law, his face a mask of impenetrable neutrality. He was the city's scale of justice, cold, precise, and perfectly balanced. Lawyers, both young and old, feared him, not for his temper, he had none, but for his unnerving, almost inhuman stillness. He would listen to the most passionate, tearful testimonies without a single flicker of emotion, his eyes like two gray stones, weighing every word, every lie, every half-truth. His world was black and white. There was the law, and there was the violation of the law. There was guilt, and there was innocence. There were no shades of gray. There was no room for messy, unpredictable human emotion. Emotion, he believed, was a poison that corroded the pure, clean machinery of justice. Today, the machine was processing a young man named Ethan. He was accused of a robbery that had gone wrong, ending in a death. The evidence was circumstantial, a flimsy web of coincidences and questionable witness accounts. The young man, Ethan, was fierce in his denial, his eyes burning with the desperate, frantic energy of a trapped animal. "I didn't do it," he would shout, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "I wasn't even there. You've got the wrong man." Judge Sterling watched him, his face impassive. He heard the boy's pleas, but he did not listen to them. He listened to the facts as they were presented. A partial fingerprint, a description that vaguely matched, a weak alibi. He saw not a terrified young man, but a variable in an equation. And the equation, however flawed, was pointing towards a result. The jury returned their verdict. Guilty. The boy, Ethan, seemed to collapse in on himself, a strangled sob escaping his lips. His public defender, a young, exhausted woman, put a comforting hand on his shoulder, but it was no use. Hope had been extinguished. Now it was time for sentencing, the final cold calculation. Judge Sterling looked down from his bench. He saw the boy, now just a broken, weeping child. He saw the jury, their faces grim. He saw the law, and the law demanded a price. He brought down his gavel. The sound was a sharp, clean crack of finality in the silent room. "On the charge of felony murder," he said, his voice a low, steady monotone, devoid of any feeling. "This court sentences you, Ethan Riley, to life in prison, without the possibility of parole." He had said those words, or words like them, thousands of times. They were just a part of the script, the final line of the play. He did not see the boy's soul shatter. He did not feel the weight of a life stolen not by a criminal act, but by a judicial one. He had performed his function. He had balanced the scales. He had served justice. He had no way of knowing that he had just taken his gavel and used it to destroy his own world. He had just sentenced a ghost, and one day, years from now, that ghost would return to deliver a verdict of its own. Years passed. The wheels of justice and of life continued to turn. Judge Sterling's reputation grew. He became a legend. Old Sterling, they called him, the last of the true judges. His name was a synonym for integrity, for an unwavering, almost frightening devotion to the letter of the law. He retired with honors. His portrait, painted in oils, was hung in the grand courthouse lobby. It captured him perfectly,
The stern face, the cold, gray eyes, the expression of a man who had weighed the world and found it wanting. He had become a monument. But monuments are lonely things. His life outside the courtroom was as silent and as ordered as his life within it. He lived alone in a large, immaculate house that felt more like a museum than a home. Everything had its place. The books on the shelves were arranged alphabetically. The furniture was severe and uncomfortable. There were no photographs on the mantelpiece, no signs of a chaotic, messy, joyful life ever having been lived within its walls. He had been married once, a lifetime ago, a brief, ill-fated union that had crumbled under the weight of his own emotional distance. She had called him a man made of marble, a man who could pass judgment on anyone but himself. She had left him, and he had never looked back. He had poured all of his passion, all of his life's energy into his work. The law was his wife, his child, his only family. Now, in the quiet of his retirement, the silence was different. It was no longer the respectful hush of a courtroom. It was a vast, suffocating emptiness. The law, his constant companion for 40 years, was gone, and he was left alone with the man he had become, a man who was a stranger even to himself. He would spend his days reading dense legal texts, a habit he couldn't break, but the words no longer held the same power. They were just ink on a page. He would sometimes find his mind drifting, an unfamiliar and unwelcome sensation. He would be reading a precedent on appellate procedure, and the face of a long-forgotten defendant would flash in his mind. Sometimes it was the face of the boy, Ethan. He didn't know why that specific case stuck with him. He had sentenced hundreds of young men to life. But there was something about that one, the boy's burning, desperate eyes, the raw animal sound of his sob when the verdict was read. It was a rare, unwelcome flicker of emotion in the sterile, ordered archives of his memory. He would dismiss it, of course. A momentary lapse. The case was closed. Justice was served. Then, his own body delivered a verdict he could not appeal. It started with a tremor in his hand, then a diagnosis, then a rapid, merciless decline. The man of iron will was betrayed by the weakness of his own flesh. The monument began to crumble. He ended up in a clean, white, private room in the best hospital in the city. The world he had once commanded was now reduced to the space between 4 beige walls. The silence was no longer his to command. It was the silence of antiseptic corridors and the quiet, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, a machine that was now the only judge of how much time he had left. He was dying, and for the first time in his life, Arthur Sterling was truly, utterly alone with his legacy, a legacy of perfect, cold, and terrible justice.
The days in the hospital bled into one another, a monotonous beige blur. Nurses came and went, their professional kindness a thin veil over the grim reality of his decay. There were no visitors. The colleagues he had known were either retired or dead. He had built no bridges to the world of personal connection, and now, at the end, there was no one to cross over to his side. He was a king dying alone in an empty castle. His mind, once a razor-sharp instrument of logic, was now clouded by pain and medication. The past, once so neatly filed away, began to leak into the present. Faces from old trials flickered at the edge of his vision. Fragments of testimony echoed in the sterile silence of the room. And more, it was the face of the boy, Ethan. His defiant, terrified eyes. The way his shoulders shook as the final, life-ending words were spoken. Judge Sterling found himself replaying the trial in his mind. not as a judge reviewing a case, but with a strange, unsettling new perspective. He saw the flimsy evidence, the exhausted public defender, the desperate, unheard pleas of the young man. For the first time in his life, a crack appeared in the marble facade of his certainty. A small, terrifying question began to form in the fog of his mind. What if? What if the equation had been wrong? One afternoon, a nurse entered his room. "Judge Sterling," she said softly, "you have a visitor." He was surprised. He hadn't had a visitor in weeks. He turned his head on the pillow, his movements slow and difficult. A woman stood in the doorway. She was in her late 60s, her face etched with a life of hardship, but her posture was straight, her eyes clear and filled with a quiet, unnerving intensity. He didn't recognize her. She was not from his world of courtrooms and law libraries. "Do I know you?" he asked, his voice a dry, papery whisper. "No," the woman said, stepping into the room. "But you should." She walked to the side of his bed and stood there, looking down at him. There was no pity in her gaze, only a strange, sad, and final kind of judgment. "My name is Mary," she said, her voice steady. 45 years ago, I was a student, young, foolish, and in love with a brilliant, ambitious young law student who had a future so bright it blinded everyone. A man who told me he loved me, but who loved the law more. Judge Sterling's clouded mind struggled to grasp the thread of her story. It sounded like a cliché, a tale from a cheap novel. "That man," Mary continued, her voice never wavering, "told me he had to focus on his career, that there was no room in his life for complications, no room for a baby. He gave me some money, and he walked away. He never looked back. He probably forgot I even existed the next day." A cold, forgotten memory began to stir in the deepest, most sealed-off chamber of Arthur Sterling's heart. A girl with bright eyes. A messy, inconvenient affair from a lifetime ago. A problem he had solved with a checkbook and a clean final break. "I kept the baby," Mary said, her voice now a blade of quiet, devastating truth. "I raised him on my own. It was hard, but he was a good boy. A little wild, a little lost, but good. He just needed a father, a guide, someone to believe in him." She paused, letting the silence in the room stretch until it was almost unbearable. 20 years ago, she said, her voice finally breaking with a lifetime of suppressed grief. "That boy, my boy, was arrested for a crime he didn't commit. He was scared. He was alone. And he was brought into a courtroom to be judged by a man who was famous for his cold, unbending justice." She leaned closer, her face now just inches from his, her eyes locking onto his, forcing him to see, to understand. He stood before his own father, and his father sentenced him to die in a cage. The roar of the crowd never reached him. It was a distant, meaningless sound, like the ocean heard from the bottom of a well. All Jacob could see was the controlled, frantic chaos in the other corner. The medics rushing the ring, the look of primal, shattering grief on Danny's father's face. And Danny, his brother, lying so terribly, unnaturally still on the canvas under the hot, unforgiving lights. Jacob stood in his corner, a statue in a hurricane of noise. The championship belt, the culmination of their shared dream, was a vulgar, obscene piece of metal they tried to wrap around his waist. He brushed it away. It felt like it was burning his skin. He had kept his promise to conquer the world, but he had broken his promise to his brother, and in doing so, he had lost both. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. The official inquiries, the hushed voices of lawyers, the word manslaughter whispered in hallways. The press called it a ring tragedy, a one-in-a-million accident. But Jacob knew what it was. It was a failure of control, a failure of his word. The boxing commission cleared him of any wrongdoing. It was a legal punch, a risk of the sport. But that verdict was a meaningless formality. He had already tried and convicted himself in the silent, merciless courtroom of his own mind. The sentence was life. He visited Danny's family once. He stood on their doorstep, the new heavyweight champion of the world, feeling smaller and weaker than he had ever felt in his life. Danny's father, a man whose face was a gray mask of grief, opened the door. He didn't yell, he didn't scream, he just looked at Jacob, his eyes empty of everything but a vast, desolate sorrow. "My son loved you," he said, his voice a dry whisper. "He believed in you. And you killed him." He quietly closed the door, and in that moment, Jacob's world ended. The man on the other side of that door hadn't just lost a son. He had lost two. Jacob never stepped into a ring again. He vacated the title, he disappeared from the public eye, turning his back on the money, the fame, the entire world he and Danny had built together. He couldn't stand the sight of a boxing glove. He couldn't bear the sound of a cheering crowd. His hands, the source of his incredible gift, now felt like alien things attached to his body. They were weapons he could no longer control, tools that had betrayed him, turning his greatest strength into his most profound curse. He began to drift. He gave away the money, wanting no part of the fortune earned on the night his brother died. He took on menial jobs, always on the move, trying to outrun the ghost that followed him. But the ghost wasn't in the gymnasiums or the arenas. It was inside him. It was in his own hands. The words hung in the sterile air of the hospital room, heavier than any law book, colder than any marble statue. He stood before his own father, and his father sentenced him to die in a cage. Arthur Sterling's world did not shatter, it dissolved. The carefully constructed reality he had lived in for 70 years, the reality of logic, of order, of absolute certainty, evaporated into a fog of unbearable, soul-crushing horror. His son, that word, a word he had never associated with himself, was now a key that unlocked a secret chamber of his past. And in that chamber was not a memory, but a ghost. The ghost of a boy with burning, terrified eyes. The ghost of a boy whose life he had taken, not once, but twice. First, by abandoning him before he was born, and second, by condemning him with a cold, indifferent stroke of a gavel. The heart monitor beside his bed, which had been beeping in a slow, steady rhythm, began to quicken its pace. A frantic, panicked beat. "Why?" he whispered, the single word a ragged, desperate plea. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't he say anything?" Mary looked at him, not with hatred, but with a profound, weary sadness. "He didn't know," she said softly. "I never told him who his father was. I was too proud, too hurt. I wanted him to be his own man, not the shadow of a man who didn't want him. He went to his grave believing his father was just another ghost who had abandoned him." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "And would it have mattered, Judge? If he had stood up in your courtroom and screamed that he was your son, would you have believed him? Or would you have seen it as just another desperate emotion to be dismissed in the face of the law?" The question was a dagger, and it found its mark. Arthur knew the answer. He wouldn't have believed him. He would have seen it as a contemptible, emotional outburst, a last-ditch effort to corrupt the clean machinery of justice. He would have been disgusted. He would have sentenced him anyway, maybe even more harshly for the sheer audacity of it. His life's work, his 40 years of unwavering devotion to the law, was a lie. He hadn't been serving justice. He had been serving his own cold, empty pride. He had built a fortress of rules and statutes to protect himself from the messy, unpredictable chaos of human connection. And in his final, greatest test, His fortress had become a tomb for his own child. He looked at Mary, the woman whose life he had ruined. He looked at the empty space beside her, where the ghost of his son now stood, his eyes no longer burning with defiance, but with a quiet, eternal accusation. The scales of justice had finally, truly been balanced, and the weight of his own sins was crushing him. The beeping of the heart monitor became faster, more erratic, a frantic, failing rhythm. He felt a sudden, sharp pressure in his chest. His breath hitched. He was a man who had lived by the finality of the verdict, and now his own was being delivered. He opened his mouth, trying to form a word, an apology, a name, something, but no sound came out. His eyes, for the first time in his life, filled with tears. He wasn't crying for the pain. He was crying for the boy he never knew, for the life he had abandoned, for the justice he had failed. The last thing Judge Arthur Sterling ever saw was the face of his son superimposed over the cracks in the hospital ceiling. A son he had met only once on opposite sides of a judgment bench. A son who was waiting for him on the other side of a final, unappealable verdict. The heart monitor let out one long, continuous, final tone. The scales were now still.